Hi everyone. We'll begin our story of American history by talking about the very first Americans, that being the native inhabitants of the Americas. And when we talk about how the earliest human beings got to the Americas, there's some pretty intriguing and compelling evidence that likely they came during a period when the Earth's atmosphere had cooled significantly, during the last so-called Ice Age, between about 20 to 30,000 years ago. So that when the Earth's global temperature dropped significantly, what happened is sea levels, ocean levels, dropped in a number of areas, in some cases by as much as 360 feet. Exposing dry land which in normal warmer times would be covered by ocean water. Now you have dry land. In the particular case of these first migrants coming from what we think of as present-day Siberia or far, far eastern Russia, what they did was they likely were coming across on an ice sheet, and they were probably tracking animals that were on the move, migrating herds of elk or bison or what have you. And so they came from likely East Asia, present-day Siberia, came across the so-called Bering Strait, this ice bridge that was created, and then began to sort of fan out through thousands of years through North America, then making their way through Central America and ultimately down to South America as well. Now, unfortunately, when we try to figure out who these first Americans were, we have a difficult time doing so because they left us no written evidence. For most Native American peoples, while they developed a spoken language very early on, they did not develop a written component to that spoken language. So we don't have the benefit of diaries or letters or legal codes to give us some insight into their particular lives on a day-to-day basis. Instead, we have to piece things together from the physical remnants of these people, their skeletal remains, the tools, the weapons that they left behind, artwork, and then, of course, oral history, the stories, the creation myths of how these peoples believe they came to be, passed down over hundreds and hundreds of generations. Unfortunately, when we do get some written records of who these earliest inhabitants were, they weren't written by the native peoples themselves. They were written by outsiders, foreigners, the Spanish, and then later the English and the French coming in. And let's just say that those first written accounts that we have by these outsiders were perhaps not all that accurate because they are written by a peoples who had no knowledge of the inner workings of these societies, and many of these Europeans who were coming in with a great deal of cultural baggage, believing themselves to be much, much superior in all ways to the Native Americans. So the first written accounts we get are quite skewed, as you might expect. But through these archaeological means, digging up the remnants of these earliest Native American inhabitants, we get a little bit of a sense of the first major culture developing around the so-called Clovis peoples. Now, they did not call themselves this. Instead, this is much later on, archaeologists in the early 20th century found what became known as the first of these Clovis sites outside Clovis, New Mexico. So we don't know what these earliest peoples called themselves, but we have to call them something. So Clovis culture is really the first discernible Native American society that we begin to see developing very, very early on, perhaps as much as 12,000 to 15,000 BC. Getting a firm date on all this is just impossible, so we have to guess. And as far as who these peoples were, they were probably moving around constantly, living a hunter-gatherer existence, as were all human beings at this early point in the stage of global history. They're moving around because their prey animals are moving around. In the case of the Clovis peoples in North America at this point in time, they're big game hunters, meaning that they want to get the most bang for their buck. So they want to go after large animals. Think bison or buffalo. Think woolly mammoths, which no longer exist today. Mastodons, which are also extinct today. Back at that point in time, they did roam the plains of North America. And we know that they were hunting some of these large animals because we found the remains of these animals with Clovis points or spears, which you think of as arrowheads embedded in their ribs. Eventually, we will see that the lives of first these early Clovis peoples, who will later go on and spread out throughout the Americas to become many other individual societies, we're going to see their lives become just a little bit easier with the development of agriculture. That is to say, learning how to plant seeds, to cultivate plants, grow them, and then harvest them. In the Americas, probably the most important staple crop over time that will be genetically modified, as we say today. Back then, they just bred different varieties together. The most important of the staple food crops, definitely corn, or maize, as it was called in many languages. Corn, very, very important. Beans, they are adapting wild sunflowers, and they are genetically breeding them to have larger kernels. So sunflower seeds will become important. Gourd crops like pumpkin, squash, what have you, these two will be very important. When you think about South America in particular, you have a few unique crops that don't make their way northward, such as tomatoes or potatoes or cacao, from which cocoa or chocolate will be extracted over time. As they develop better agricultural techniques, you will see some societies beginning to settle down, or at least adapt a semi-nomadic lifestyle in which they travel part of the year and then they stay in one place part of the year. To give you an idea of how quickly these peoples begin to develop very unique societies, this may seem like a strange map to put up here. It's actually a linguistic map, or a language map, of North America around the time of Columbus's arrival by the late 15th century. But this language map already goes to show you how diverse these early Native American peoples had become over the many thousands of years in which they spread out across the landscape. They're adapting to unique ecosystems. They are developing their unique political systems, unique languages. So I say all this by way of saying that we're going to be touching on a tiny, tiny handful of Native American societies in this lecture. We are leaving off the table hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of very unique and compelling societies just because we don't have time to touch on them all. Now, discussing all these unique societies is, like I said, we just don't have time to do that, but we can boil things down to a few essential common characteristics that were shared amongst many of these so-called pre-Columbian peoples. That term just refers to what their lives were like before Europeans, like Christopher Columbus, before they arrived here in the Americas. And so we'll start with the idea of that land in many of these cultures was considered sacred. It was considered to be of spiritual significance. And this will be very different from the conception of land that later Europeans, like the Spanish or the Portuguese or the English, their conception of land. Land was considered not as a commodity, the way many Europeans considered. It's not something to be bought and sold. Instead, amongst many of these peoples, it was considered to be shared for the benefit of all in their community. So that's why I have on this slide here, for instance, the caution sign that we're going to see some culture clashes developing between Native American peoples and the first Europeans who will come over, first as conquerors and then later as settlers. And land is going to be a huge bone of contention between these two groups. They just have such different conceptions of what land should be used and how it can be traded or not traded in the case of natives. And then assigned gender roles. We'll see a little bit of a culture clash here as well. Many of the first Europeans who came over, again as outsiders, are going to perceive Native American women incorrectly, I might add, but they're going to view Native American women as little more than slaves of all things. For example, in 1644, the Reverend John Megalopensis, a minister at a Dutch church in New Netherlands, what would later become the New York colony, complained that Native American women were, quote, in his words, obliged to prepare the land, to mow, to plant, and to do everything, but that the men, he said, do nothing except hunting, fishing, and going to war against their enemies. And you'll see that over and over again. The gender roles in Native American societies were that women were largely, their work was largely geared around child care, food preparation. They planted crops, they cultivated those crops. Men, in contrast, were responsible for hunting, which was also part of securing food, a very important task. But hunting, patrolling their lands to make sure that others were not coming to take their territory away from them, military protection, these sorts of things. And for Native American peoples, this division of labor was quite understandable. It helped them significantly over time, but Europeans mistakenly viewed this as that women were slaves and had no voice. That was not the case. In fact, in many Native American societies, women were exalted, especially women in legend. They were, in many Native American creation stories, for instance, it's women who were thought to have created life and were very highly regarded. So this is going to be one among many ways in which we're going to see Europeans, when they arrive, coming into conflict with Native peoples. Another common thread amongst most Native American peoples was their form of political organization. Without a doubt, the most common way in which they organized themselves into political units was that of the chiefdom. And as you can see here, chiefdoms were very small in size. They might have been 25, maybe 50 square miles in diameter. So very, very small. We have the peoples living in this chiefdom underneath the rule of a hereditary and often semi-divine chief. By that phrase, I mean someone who was not considered to be a god, but someone who had a link to the spiritual world. And for these towns that constituted a chiefdom, they would pay tribute or honor to the common chief. And these were small units in which the chief held, pretty much absolute authority. So let's think about Europeans then when they arrive in the Americas. This is not the type of political system in Spain. This is not the type of political system in England or the Netherlands. Instead, they're coming from very large monarchies, ruled by one, right? Monarchy. And so when the first Europeans come over, as they try to negotiate access to land, for instance, or they try to develop alliances between these various native groups, their first question is going to be, take me to your king, by which these native peoples are not really going to understand what you mean by king, but the best they can translate that is okay, I'll take you to my chief. And so alliances made at this local level with one particular chief would not hold as an alliance with another chief 100 miles, in another valley. So for Europeans, this is deeply confusing, this sort of scattered, diffuse political system across the Americas. And it's just going to be another of many cases of culture clash between the two groups. And then the final way in which we see Native Americans ultimately coming into deep conflict with Europeans is the very common feature across these tribes of animist religious worship. And in its broadest sense, when we think about animism, we think about sort of a religious belief system that at its core holds the idea that there's a common spiritual life force that animates or infuses people and objects in the environment. A mountain has spiritual significance. The land, as we've already mentioned, the land itself held spiritual significance. Animals, people as well, can also be infused by this common spiritual force. And so from the standpoint of many Europeans, again, here we go back to future culture clash, when they come over, theirs is a monotheistic belief system. Mono meaning one, right? A belief in one deity. And this does not translate easily. So when many Europeans come over, they will be interested in exporting their version, in particular of Christianity, either Roman Catholicism or a Protestant version of Christianity. For the native peoples, they don't see why they should have to abandon their traditional belief system, and they simply don't understand this belief that there's one deity instead of a manifestation of spiritual forces through lots of different animals and plants and people and what have you. So some pretty significant differences developing very early on with Europeans and native peoples. And we'll pick up in the next part of this lecture, part 2, with religion and different tribal peoples. Take a little closer look into their lives.